What are your expectations from the budget?
Financial year that is ending, the revenue growth has been exceptionally poor. Revenue growth up till November was only 3.3% compared to last year, gross tax revenues, whereas the budget had estimated almost 11% increase will take place. So I expect that there will be, whether it is concealed amongst various things or more upfront, that there will be a renewed thrust on curbing central government expenditure.
But what is the impact on labor rights in such a scenario where there's increased privatization, rising unemployment, and rising inequality? What is the impact of labor rights in such a scenario?
That the condition of labor has actually been more and more depressed as a result of this kind of increased push towards more and more privatization. You have a sort of concentration of high wages, high professional fees at the top. And then you have a kind of increasingly depressed sort of V where you have contractualization, where you have very, very, higher and fire kind of labor laws. And these are all sort of accepted now. Just recently we saw the gig workers. Just recently we saw the kind of, agricultural discontent that is facing us, agricultural wages and so on. So I think, we are staving off crisis after crisis.
There has been signals from the finance minister around further mergers and possible privatization of ongoing foreign investment. What is the purpose really behind such mergers and privatization?
There are reports that more and more foreign investment is actually going to be invited in shareholding of Indian banks, and these I think are most sinister developments, because what this signifies is that how gradually the public money invested with the banks, that is something which is gradually being weaned away from, which is going to be deployed for the benefit of the corporates. And our previous experience, when we look at bank mergers, the proposition to merge banks into four, we know what has happened. We know that bank branches of public sector banks, which used to be there, which we would see in towns and cities, that has actually shrunk. The public sector branches, now almost 1 lakh branches have reduced if we look from 2014 to now, and we know that in 2020 the bank merger happened.
If you actually look at India's situation at the moment, there was a period before 2008, a few years, in which there was a massive growth of investment. Roughly half of the increased expenditure in that period was accounted for by investment, with the private corporate sector leading it. So it's possible to invest more. It's not that the economy cannot generate. We have actually a situation in the economy, we are neither able to use fully our investment potential, nor able to use fully our employment potential. We have unemployment and we have lack of investment.
Hi, I'm Shravasti Dasgupta from The Wire. As India approaches another union budget, questions around privatization and the future of public institutions have dominated the discourse. The names of Gautam Adani and Mukesh Ambani have come up a lot during elections, particularly as opposition parties have sought to set a narrative that increasing privatization and wealth concentration, particularly in the hands of a few billionaires, has been at the expense of the larger public. But what has been the impact of such policies? Is privatization in India today truly about broad-based economic dynamism, or is it fostering market concentration and monopolization across key sectors, whether it's airlines and ports to energy, telecom, and banking? What will be the consequences for employment, labor rights, credit access, and affordability in an increasingly unequal economy with rising household debt? And what can we expect in all these sectors from the upcoming budget? To discuss all this, I am being joined by Surajit Majumdar. He's a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Aditi Ghosh Mehta is a retired officer of the Rajasthan cadre of the IAS and has worked largely in the tribal and rural areas of the state. holding roles that integrated development and cultural preservation, as well as Amitanshu Verma. He's a researcher with the Center for Financial Accountability, where he examines how India's financial system serves all these policies that we have just mentioned. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Let's get started with, since this discussion essentially wants to focus on privatization and its impact that it's had on India's economy, I think it's a good place to start is that a lot of us in general conversations about the politics and economy in India right now are familiar with two names, and that is Gautam Adani and Mukesh Ambani, which is something that political parties in the opposition, the Congress particularly, and even others continue to reference over and over again, how everything is going to the hands of a few billionaires, particularly these two, and which is at the expense of the larger public. So, is there a thrust on privatization and asset monetization in this government's policy, or are we now slowly seeing a shift away from this?
Well, I think what you're seeing is that the process of privatization is something that has on the one hand, a real self-reinforcing character, and secondly, a process that leads to an increased concentration. And the two are mutually related. So you begin from the proposition that if the state takes too much of an intervention in the economy, if the state taxes heavily the corporate sector, and if it borrows too much, this is a process that crowds out private investment and impedes the dynamism of the economy. So you constrain that, therefore you place private investment as in the driver's seat of the economy. Once you do that, you tie your own hands, the state ties its own hands and places the private sector as the driver's seat of the economy, then the leverage of that private sector over what the state does or does not do increases, because the state has to now create conditions in which the animal spirits of private investment will be unleashed. And then that process of privatization leads to an increased concentration, so that what you get is not just that the private sector has, as a collective, has a greater leverage over deciding what the state's policies will be, but it also becomes more individualized and particularized, because now the key positions in the economy are occupied by a few major players. So what they do or do not do makes a significant difference to the economic context, and therefore there is a kind of attitude of permissiveness towards them and encouragement of their activities. So it's a process that keeps on pushing more and more in that direction. And what we are seeing now is actually a phase in which not only is this happening, because the investment that involves actually expanding the capacities of the economy to produce, because that is not paying very much. There is a shift towards these big players acquiring more and more control over the economic activities, which till now are not in that domain. So whether it's the public sector or whether it is the rest of the private sector, the unorganized sector, you get a tendency to grab all of that. So it's a kind of parasitic process that is actually underway, which goes by various names and forms like asset monetization, privatization. But it's not only about this. It has a much larger domain where basically a few big private players, for them things have to be opened up for their increasing their degree of dominance and control over the economy. So it's a self-reinforcing process that is actually at work. And asset monetization is actually a rather perverse expression. I mean, it's a rather perverse process where you basically take over, the state takes over all the risks of investing. And after those assets are created, you hand them over or lease them to the private sector. Those assets which can pay, you hand them over to the private sector. And you justify this in the name of the fact that private sector is not investing. Well, if private sector is not investing, the natural conclusion should be, then you cannot depend on them to actually drive this economy. And therefore, public investment has to step in. But instead of mobilizing resources by, say, taxing them, what you do is you mobilize resources by handing over your already existing assets created by public investment to them.
What's coming to my mind, listening to what you've just explained to us, and Aditi Mehta, I want to come to you on this, is the fact that the recently, I think, a manifestation of private sector kind of taking control and the state handing over in certain ways to the private sector was the Indigo crisis, where we saw that a duopoly essentially had created such a situation in which lakhs of people, thousands of people were left in the lurch, and the government was in a sense caught in a situation where their hands were tied, having handed over in a sense the entire airline sector to them. So the question really that has come up since then is that what is the role of competition, especially in sectors like airlines, oil refining, coal and fuel, where there is a lot of conversation about privatization and concentration. What is the role that competition can play?
See, I think you ask a very good question, but I want to just go back to what Shubhajit said. I don't really think it's about individual companies or individual oligarchs. It really is about the regulatory framework, the guardian institutions that allow this kind of favoritism to not just exist, but to actually exponentially grow, as we have been seeing. And your example of Indigo Airlines dominating the airspace really then comes to mind. But I wanted to also just say that it is also, it goes back to the kind of economy we ourselves, I mean the powers that be, seeks to promote. Now, I still remember being very, very taken aback when the Niti Aayog spokesman said that actually they want to promote national champions. Now, what is a national champion? So if you want to, as a state wants to really promote this kind of economic Darwinism, even amongst the industrial class that it has, and then back them to the hilt, it means that you are trying to promote kind of oligarch development, a few selected sector leaders or industry leaders to really then forge the way ahead. This is bound to, as he said, there is a kind of logic, therefore, to a kind of monopolistic growth that is bound to take place. And even today, I want to say, even the narrative of power is controlled by the same few oligarchs. And the public discourse, therefore, is shaped. I'm just coming back from the Jaipur Literature Festival, and it's amazing. You will not hear any more voices of tribals, voices of the underground, voices of the Dalits. They used to exist earlier on, but today you really will not. And I've gone a little bit away from what you were asking me, but I think this just goes to prove exactly the same thing, that the entire discourse is also being shaped to a kind of conclusion that really aids exactly the kind of activity that you have forced the whole stream of events to. And this is something, so there is an elite capture, of course, of the public imagination, of course, of the public sphere. But you also have civil society further diminished because of the very real fear of, malicious retaliation and all kinds of other such activity.
Amitanshu, I want to come to you now that there has been signals from the finance minister around further mergers and possible privatization of ongoing foreign investments, and especially in public sector banks, which has been a huge point of speculation whether that's going to happen, not going to happen. What is the purpose really behind such mergers and privatization?
Thanks, Travasti, for that question. And I would also hark back to what the context which Surajit laid. A lot of times when we discuss privatization, monetization, we actually tend to ignore how finance capital is also being monopolized simultaneously. And what we see right now is that the question of banking, and that's how it has been for since independence, that whether banking capital, the money and savings of millions of Indians, billions of Indians, whether that is going to be deployed for profit, or is that going to be deployed for the benefit of the people. And what we are seeing is, and some very ominous indications which we are getting, which you just mentioned, that the finance minister has said that we need to open room for privatization of more banks, and there is discussion of reducing from 12 public sector banks that we have now to 4 public sector banks. There are reports that more and more foreign investment is actually going to be invited in shareholding of Indian banks, and these I think are most sinister developments, because what this signifies is that how gradually the public money invested with the banks, that is something which is gradually being weaned away from, which is going to be deployed for the benefit of the corporates. And our previous experience, when we look at bank mergers, the proposition to merge banks into 4, we know what has happened. We know that bank branches of public sector banks which used to be there, which we would see in towns and cities, that has actually shrunk. The public sector branches now, almost a lakh branches have reduced if we look from 2014 to now, and we know that in 2020 the bank merger happened. And this is something we know that this has limited credit access of people who are there, of small traders, of domestic workers, of the working class. That credit access has gradually shrunk owing to this. And we know, and we'll come to this later, that how this withdrawal of public banks has been accompanied by a proliferation and mushrooming of all these kind of semi-regulated and poorly regulated ecosystem of NBFCs, of loan apps, which you see on every street corner, whether you are visiting villages or towns. And that's the kind of direction which we have seen that bank mergers have taken. Now, I would also want to raise this issue here, that who is this meant to benefit? A bank merger, who is supposed to benefit? So what we know is that all banks have certain prudential norms. There are regulations about exposure limits, that you cannot have a beyond credit exposure to a single entity beyond a point. I think that's 20 to 25% kind of limit. The moment you merge banks, you have a far larger pool of banking capital which can be extended to the borrowers, and these are big borrowers that we are talking about. So that's the kind of direction which one is seeing, and this is not at all in tune or in alignment of what India actually needs, which is credit access for the small businesses, for the individuals. That's something what we need, and that's not what we are seeing right now. So yeah, that's
Just to build on that, because a lot of criticism that comes for this government is the fact that it's Sood Boot Ki Sarkar back in 2014. We had heard about that. But in the last decade or so, this kind of push towards privatization at the expense of public investment by the government itself has taken a backseat. So, what kind of impact has it had, in your opinion, in the last decade, with the state increasingly retreating in favor of private enterprises?
See, I would say you look at it like this, that either you accept the proposition that within 140 crore Indians, there are only a handful of families which genetically are made to be successful in the field of business, or you accept that there's something about the process that is happening which is concentrating so much of the control over the economy in a few hands. Okay. Otherwise, if you are saying that entrepreneurship is supposed to flourish, then you should have a very large number of people succeeding. But why is it that so much control over the assets in the economy has come to be concentrated in the hands of a few families? Now, the point is that the process of competition itself, especially in several activities which have been opened up to the private sector in the last 25-30 years, okay, without regulation, you cannot even actually sustain competition. Okay. Without regulation, you can't. Monopolization is the inherent tendency. And what has actually happened is that in many of these sectors, the state has withdrawn. You can see the same story in telecom as in airline. Indigo was in the news recently. But what about telecom? Same story. You opened it up, several players entered. Now you don't remember most of them. It's basically two players are left. Same with airlines. Okay. So what happens is that these are activities in which you might privatize, but the state still has to remain in the picture to regulate. Now, if your regulation is permissive rather than disciplining, then you are going to get actually this kind of a scenario where you have concentration. And what happens is that if the state's regulation either has to be strict or you have to regulate in a way that sustains competition. So look at the crisis that happened in the airline sector. Now, Indigo has 60% of the market, Air India has 35%, the rest have 5%. Now, even if Air India had 10% extra capacity, how much of Indigo's business could be lost to Air India? 5 to 6%, that's all. How many passengers can switch between airlines? Whereas if you had, say, 10 different airlines with 10% market share, each with a 10% excess capacity could take away any one airline's entire business. Then the logic of competition works there. Here you are allowing this scenario where now what happens is what you see here, that even in a case like the airlines, ultimately Indigo's demand that more time should be given to meet those norms happened. It got away with it because it was too big to fail. So that's the kind of situation that kind of gets created because of this kind of a. Now it's like this: if you want the airline sector to grow, if you want to ensure that these problems don't happen, how do you achieve it? The medium through which you do it are these big players who are already now in that dominant position. So they will dictate willy-nilly. Whether you want it or not, they will dictate to a large measure what the policy approach of the state will be. And that's the and this is in a specific sector. You look at the larger context of it, that when a few players then are in control, they are dictating everything about what the economy is. So where is therefore your even democracy? People may choose who is going to sit in government, but they are not choosing what those governments will be doing, because that is being controlled by an entirely different process where these people have. So this process, as I said, is a self-reinforcing process. So you keep on getting more and more. Private sector is not investing, give them more concessions. Give them more concessions, privatize a little bit more, create space for them to invest. It's concession after concession after concession. You have actually a reality today where you've had 1.5 decades in which private sector investment has not been picking up. 1.5 decades, and you still think that they will provide the answer, and therefore more concessions have
And
to
this
be
is an
given.
interesting point that you have made, that you are saying that private sector investment has not picked up despite this push for privatization. So what does it mean if that you keep pushing privatization, but the investing capacity of private capital is not to the expectation that one would think? What does that mean really?
Well, the problem is not of resources. It's not that it cannot be invested. If you actually look at India's situation at the moment, there was a period before 2008, a few years, in which there was a massive growth of investment. Roughly half of the increased expenditure in that period was accounted for by investment, with the private corporate sector leading it. So it's possible to invest more. It's not that the economy cannot generate. We have actually a situation in the economy, we are neither able to use fully our investment potential nor able to use fully our employment potential. We have unemployment and we have lack of investment. And the two are related. So if you have conditions in which the private investment is not generating significant enough employment to overcome the slack that is there, we have a large labor surplus. Okay, if you are not able to generate increased employment, what does it do? It basically means large number of people remain stuck on low wages, because there's always a large army of unemployed to put a pressure on the wage level. Then what happens is that if then this investment takes place in activities which produce things which have to be sold. Where are the buyers for it? You're not able to export enough. You're not able to sell in the domestic market enough. Then what do you end up doing? You then cut back on investments because they're not paying. And when those investments you cut back, you add to that problem, because investment is also an expenditure that creates demand. So it's like a cycle in which you get stuck, and the answer that this condition always invites is more privatization, more concessions to the private sector. So private sector can, without investing, and that's the point. You want to have national champions, fine, have national champions. But you also put some conditions in that they have to deliver. They're not national champions for their sake. If you're going to have national champions, they must be for the sake of the economy as a whole. Are they delivering?
I think what Professor Majumdar is essentially hinting at is that the government cannot take a hands-off approach in terms of privatization. But I want to ask you that in terms of the previous budgets that we have seen with this push towards privatization, there has also been a talk about, in every budget presentation, we will see the finance minister talking about the ease of doing business and how trust-based governance and how we need to help businesses make their businesses grow easier in India. But what is the impact on labor rights in such a scenario where there's increased privatization, rising unemployment, and rising inequality? What is the impact of labor rights in such a scenario, and what do you expect from this budget in that regard?
I will say, and we've been watching it, we've been all seeing it, that the condition of labor has actually been more and more depressed as a result of this kind of increased push towards more and more privatization. You have a sort of concentration of high wages, high professional fees at the top. And then you have a kind of increasingly depressed sort of V, where you have contractualization, where you have very, very, hire and fire kind of labor laws. And these are all sort of accepted now increasingly. So you have this core of, highly paid employees and a peripheral workforce. So you don't even you don't even give them permanency. You don't give them any of the other benefits which were taken and accepted for granted. Certainly no pensions, certainly no medical facilities and so on. And so you see a very deeply entrenched kind of, what should I say, semi-immiserization. I don't like to use these kind of terms, but this is actually what is happening, of the large swath of working people in our country. But I want to just go back to what Shubhajit was saying. In the 70s and 80s, there was actually state control and awareness of this natural concentration of power, of natural concentration of capital in certain sectors and certain firms. And there was a full-scale, Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Commission and an act which actually would hold meetings. And there was an awareness in the government that monopolies are something that have to be controlled, only because once you're a monopoly, then you actually set the rules, and you also you're the judge as well as the deliberator, which is actually wrong in any system and setup. So I think this is something that the state itself has done. This is the ideology of the state. And it was not the ideology then of the state. So there is a fundamental difference in the kind of, in the definition of the animal we are now really confronted with. And the second thing you were talking about is, how do you see this impacting labor? How do you see this impacting among working folks? Well, you can see this in the kind of disaffection. Just recently we saw the gig workers. Just recently we saw the kind of, agricultural discontent that is facing us, agricultural wages and so on. So I think, we are staving off crisis after crisis and actually really ignoring them. And as I said, there is also a kind of capture of the discourse, because the media itself is also controlled and severely curtailed in its independence. And so we are sort of really foised with a very contradictory situation where the reality of so many sectors doesn't come to the surface, and we are unable to really ascertain what exactly should be the correct path for any, welfare oriented system to follow.
In fact, just to follow up on that, is that this welfare mode of the government has been discouraged in the last decade or so. There has been a popular narrative around it that the state should not be, I mean, giving even 80 crore people free ration, because that is not the job of the state. And we are, in a sense, discouraging people from becoming workers by providing them with free rations. What kind of impact does that have on labor, where there is fewer jobs and there is this kind of discourse which is kind of, in a way, ridiculing the living circumstances that people are living in?
Absolutely, I think you've really articulated it. And you have a very strong and steep diminution in the kind of, for instance, the money. Well, you've taken back NREGA, but you've even successively decreased the allotments and allocations towards this sector. You would have a whole slew of, what do I say? I mean, they're not really poverty alleviation programs, but certainly programs that allowed the poor to work, to increase and improve their skills, and to function. And here today, increasingly, you have very few programs that are based on actually that sector of society. You would actually earlier have programs that looked at at targeting the poor, in terms of policies, in terms of incomes, in terms of allocations from the budget. Now that has stopped, except for one or two major programs. The allocations for those have also systematically gone down. So you're here with exactly what you say, a kind of distant contempt for the basic knowing reality of your society. So if you forget, or if you actually have contempt for the poor, and you almost have, like in America, an ideology that it is your fault that you're poor, then you have a whole different way of looking at the economy, at the people who are making money, and at the people who are not. So I think these are things that we tend to actually ignore. And I mean, as I was saying, you have very few voices of people who are at the margins these days. And I think they have things to tell us and educate us. They have so many visions of even the way of leading a life today, which are very, very modern and contemporary, like for the environment and so on. So I think this is the way we are sort of hurtling down a very strange and divergent path, really, from where we started initially in planning.
Amitansh, in such a situation where policies are not addressing these concerns, there's a rising household indebtedness, what role can public sector banks really play to address these gaps, or credit gaps, particularly where it's not coming from the government? What role can public sector banks play, and do you think that the budget can address this?
So, Shravasti, the financial sector is actually symptomatic of this crisis which is brewing, where real wages are not rising, where people are not finding employment which is gainful, and and the credit sources have really shrunk. The credit access, loan access, that's something which has really shrunk. So what we are seeing is that the household debt is at unprecedented levels in India. I think it's almost 40 to 50% of the GDP, if I'm not wrong. And how and what is this kind of household debt? When we look at the government figures themselves, they point a picture where people are taking loans for health, where people are taking loans for education. These two sectors perhaps form the bulk of these loans. These are not loans which are being taken by people for, say, asset creation or income generating activities. So at the same time, what we are seeing is that that the public sector banks, which had a far more penetration, that has shrunk, and people are being forced to take these loans from NBFCs, MFIs, which charge huge interest rates. And now, in fact, as a symptom of this crisis, what we can probably say is that this is a new debt crisis which is brewing, because you see newspapers, you see news reports from the districts. We find people committing suicides owing to exploitative recovery practices, not being able to pay loans, suffering social stigma owing to that incapacity. So what we are seeing is that the banking sector, which was planned in fact from bank nationalization onwards to serve this segment, to provide easy credit to agriculture, to small business, that has completely shirked its responsibility. This is something which began happening from the 90s, and now we are seeing the impacts, and from 2014 we can see to the extent this has been hastened, this process. And that's why it also makes sense that the finance minister is also considering proposals to have people from private banks to head public sector banks. So in this grim trajectory, in the sense that what needs to be done, if I think there needs to be brick and mortar branches in every district, in every block of public sector banks. There needs to be a ceiling on interest rates which lenders can ask. You cannot be asking 50%, 100%, 200% interest rates, which some of these NBFCs and loan apps are doing, and luring people with easy conditions. So we need bank expansion. We are going in exactly the opposite direction. But if the budget were to address that, I think there needs to be some kind of capital infusion towards that. And these banks, all these public sector banks are profit-making banks. They already have capital which can be used to expand banking services, to make credit accessible. And this is something which is not going to, this is not a financial burden for the banks, because what we are seeing is, and connecting to what Surajit said about monopolization, we know that monopolization is something which has been supported by the financial sector. We have in the last 10 years almost 16 lakh crore of write-offs, and much bigger figure which has actually gone to the private sector, which has taken this public money and invested it. We know that the banking sector can bear this huge amount of write-off for the corporate sector. There is no financial hurdle in extending credit, and even loan waivers and write-offs in case the credit fails for the small borrowers. Those figures tend to be very small. So I think there needs to be more capital infusion, and at least the budget should set the stage for this banking expansion. So that's something which one can hope for.
All right. So finally, just taking off from what you're saying, that last year we saw that last year and the year before that, after the Lok Sabha elections, there was a lot of conversation about the fact that the government has sought to self-correct with the internship programs that was announced in the budget, or whether it was reducing the income tax slabs. What are your expectations from the budget this time in terms of what should the thrust be on the in the budget itself, given all the problems that we have kind of laid down in the last 30 minutes and painted a very grim picture? But what do you think the thrust of the budget should
Well,
be?
the one thing that one can say with certainty is perhaps that what the budget will be quite different from what the budget needs to be. Okay, that's the critical difference thing. So if one looks at the last 5 years, in fact, if you look at the last 15 years, what has been the priority in the budget making? The priority has been to curb the fiscal deficit from the levels it had reached after the 2008 crisis fiscal stimulus. And 15 years of trying hasn't brought it back. But that's been the attempt. The burden of that adjustment has largely fallen on the expenditure side. That is, you keep the expenditure under control. In between, because of the other conditions, you are increasing the scale of tax concessions. So the revenue side is, because of tax measures, under stress. But now you're also seeing, and then again post-COVID, within 1 year, of the COVID pandemic came, naturally the deficit went up because half the economy was shut down, revenues fell, there was some stepping up of expenditure which was necessary, and after that, from the very next year, you started the process of bringing that deficit down. That's the emphasis that is there. So that's going to continue. And now this year, you're likely to see even more difficult situation, because in the financial year that is ending, the revenue growth has been exceptionally poor. This is true for both direct taxes as well as indirect taxes, much below so far what we know. We have information up to December for some, up to January for direct taxes. We have up to November for the entire set of revenues. Revenue growth up till November was only 3.3% compared to last year, gross tax revenues, whereas the budget had estimated almost 11% increase will take place. So I expect that there will be, whether it is concealed amongst various things or more upfront, that there will be a renewed thrust on curbing central government expenditure.
All right. All right. And finally, what are the social consequences of this do you anticipate in this budget?
I also want to just add one thing. You talked about ease of doing business. Well, it's very ironic that we conceive of ease of doing business, and then we do make such concessions in things like Environmental Protection Act, or just the kind of permissions we are willing to give on the side of environmental correctness, like the whole issue of the Aravalis, just as a case in point, which will really set us back by decades and decades of the slow kind of meticulous planning and work that so many governments and people have undertaken on the field. And this is also, if you like, from one lens of viewing it, a kind of ease of doing business, because then you allow for land to be given to industrialists and without any consideration of the kind of negative fallout effects they'll have on the environment. But when you say, what are the other, you said you were asking about what you think will impact the poor. I really feel that I don't think the poor are any more a point of consideration, frankly. It's a very hard kind of statement. It's very hard for people like us to even accept it and swallow it, because we are still used to the idea of a government that really will husband the resources carefully and put them to the common weal. But and how people actually accept this is also something that we need to see, because increasingly I think the trajectory of people's tolerance and forbearance for these things is really called into question. You can see the kind of just people's movements that have coalesced around some of these issues that we've all been discussing. So I really don't have a very hopeful picture myself.
And a last word from you on what your expectations from the budget is this time, given the privatization concerns and the inequality that we are facing today. What are your expectations?
I would reiterate some similar things which have been said. One is that I think we need to have revenue generation measures coming in this ideally, which actually generate revenue from where wealth concentration has already happened. This concentration we know has happened owing to public money being directed, finances being redirected to some of those corporate houses. We see Adani controlling probably more than half of the port sector. And none of these monopolies are these monopolies, as pointed out, these are really harmful for the economy, for any kind of policy implementation, if there is one person who is controlling these major chunks of this thing. So I think wealth needs to be taken away through different measures, through different kind of taxes. In terms of environmental and climate issues, that's something which has become even more pertinent, that we need to take wealth from those who have polluted the most. That's what the government argues at the international forum. That needs to be done domestically also, through different measures, through different penalties on people who control coal, people who control some of these big logistic sectors. So ideally this is something which one can imagine, but yeah.
All right, so we'll have to keep an eye on what really happens, and then budget is going to be presented on February 1st, so we'll have some of these answers then. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us, and thank you to our viewers for watching.